So the book that I read for my project was The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. The book was published in 1931, and Buck won a Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1938 for this title. It's part of a trilogy that she wrote about the House of Wang, which is the main character. She was born in the US, but her parents were missionaries. So they traveled pretty much after she was born to China, and they worked with rural villages there and promoted humanitarian efforts. So she grew up with parents that were activists, and that definitely contributed to her work. So 5 facts about her that contribute to her literature. She was in China until 1934, so she spent a majority of her life working in China. Like I said before, The Good Earth was published in 1931, which means that she was there during a really turbulent time for China. It was the beginning of communism in the area. There was about to be a war with Japan. So at this time, the US, not knowing very much about China, took to this book really well. It helped actually benefit the Chinese because Americans were reading this book, getting a feel for what the conditions were like in China, and that led them to agree more to pairing up with the Chinese against Japan. And like I said before, her parents were missionaries in rural China, which meant that at an early age she was exposed to peasant life in China, which means that her book centered around that demographic. So the main characters in her book lived in poverty and eventually rose to be a noble family, but she was exposed mostly to life in the rural areas. Her Chinese name was Tsai Shenchu, so that means that when she was in China she went by Tsai Shenchu. So Zhenchu would be her first name and Tsai would be her last name. So that means that when she was growing up in China, she probably went by that name and probably felt more Chinese than American because she spent so much of her life developing social skills and language skills in China. She returned to the US in 1935, so about 4 years after this book was published, and she became a women's and minority activist in the US. And I think that ties in a lot to this title because in The Good Earth, she speaks a lot about women's rights. She talks about, the plight of the poor, but also how Wang's wife Olan is mistreated by him and replaced by a mistress, and how women were just seen as lesser by the binding of their feet and a lot of the social norms that are put on them. So I'll talk about that later. And later she was known for her work in Chinese and minority adoption in the US, so she actually adopted children of her own. So that was something that was near and dear to her, especially living in the peasant areas in China. She saw that American families could make a difference for Chinese children, and it was important for her to spread the idea that despite children being a minority or being adopted into a white family that's not of their own race, they can still be a great way to bring a family together. So it was very important for her to pursue that. So a brief synopsis of The Good Earth. It starts with Wang Wang, the main character. He lives with his father in a hut, basically. A little tiny hut with about 2 rooms. He lives on a farm, he's a farmer, and because he's worked in the fields, he's tanned, he's rough, he's calloused, he doesn't have the look of a rich man. He is unable to get a wife. So what he has to resort to is going to the House of Wang, which is the local noble family. They have a huge mansion, which is miles from his home. So he has to walk to the House of Wang where his elderly father, who's very old and who's ailing, has set up an arranged marriage. So he goes to the house and he has to pick up his wife, whose name is Olan. She's very quiet. She was born into slavery, so she was born in the House of Wang. So he takes her in and takes her home, and she has to integrate herself into their family. So the second that she's brought in, she has to take care of her new father-in-law, she has to take care of the house. So Wang Wang, before meeting her, tried to prepare the house so that it was set for her. He went to the market and he bought meats and different things that were more expensive than what he was used to. He cleaned himself up, tried to look as presentable as possible for going to the nobleman's house. So we begin with their marriage. She becomes part of the family and quickly has a child. which is very, very important in Chinese culture to have not only a son, but to have children as long as your wife is able to have children. So they quickly, about 10 months later, have a son. She's integrated herself into the farm life, and Olan actually gives birth alone. She is working in the fields, she goes into labor, and she gives birth alone in her room and cleans up the entire mess before her husband even walks in to meet the son. So that is a way for Pearl Esbuck to explain that women are not only separate from the men in their household, now there would be 3 men in the household because she had a son, but that they were meant to be almost ashamed of their bodies, and that she was meant to give labor on her own, almost like an animal, the way that they described her cleaning up her own blood and then quickly getting back in bed with the baby so that when her husband walked in it was presentable and just domestic and serene. Said a lot about not only the character of Olan and the way that Chinese women were treated at the time, but also Pearl Esbuck's opinion on women and what she had seen in the peasant villages that she had lived in. So after the birth of their son, they go out, they buy red eggs, which are a celebration dish that they typically provide for their guests when Chinese families meet their grandchildren and nieces and nephews for the first time. So the fact that it's a boy is significant. The fact that the baby has lived a month is very significant because in Chinese culture, babies aren't named until, nowadays they name them when they're born, but in these rural villages at the time, the Chinese did not present the child to the world. The mother was not allowed to leave her bed for a month until the baby had reached 1 month of age, which meant that it had survived. Let's see. So then the farm begins to grow. They have another son, which is a really big deal that Olan would be able to provide another child for him and for it to be a boy. Ching, their local farmer friend, becomes a major part of their lives. He later shows up in the book when they have a larger farm, but right now he supports them. He remains their friend. But when Olan becomes pregnant with her 3rd child, things take a turn for the worse. The harvest has been awful. They stopped praying to their god, their incense shrine at the top of the hill for the new year. They didn't even talk to him. They didn't even talk to their gods because of the shape that the harvest was in. So when Olan gave birth to the 3rd baby, it was a girl, and she ended up killing it. She ended up killing the 3rd child. She smothered it and did not show Wang her baby, which is very significant. That's a big social comment on Buck's part because not only did it display the killing, the infanticide of female babies, which is still an issue in China, but it also showed that the poor harvest and their starvation was making it so that Olan could not even keep her children. So they ended up fleeing the land, even though recently they had acquired extra land from the Huang household. So that nobleman's household was actually suffering at the time because of the poor harvest, and they sold land to Wang Wang. Land is the most important thing. It's a reoccurring theme in this book to rural families that when you own the land, you own your own investments, you can keep track of your money. It's best to put your money back in the land. That's what Wang Wang believes. That's what he believes the entire book. But they have to desert their land, even though they hadn't had a chance to harvest it yet. So they move to the city. I think Olan's pregnant again at this time, and gives birth to another girl who they keep, but because she's so famished, because they can't afford food, she actually becomes mentally disabled, and Wang Wang nicknames her the poor fool, and she becomes one of the only children in the end that really takes to him and that is loyal to him, even though she probably is on the autism spectrum. So at the time, they're eating out of soup kitchens, rice kitchens, and the grandfather and Olan, the mother, they stay in their little hut of a home that they've built on the side of the road in one of these little shanty towns, and they begin to beg for money so that they can go home. If they don't have enough money, they won't be able to survive in the city, but they also won't be able to return to their land, which is their main goal. So Wang Wang becomes a rickshaw driver. So he takes rich people to and from their houses and foreigners, American foreigners, who are traveling to the area. And the Chinese are confused by the blonde hair of these foreigners, and they also charge them extra more yen for the rickshaw rides because they know they can milk them for extra money. So eventually they gain enough money. They don't first, before they leave to go back to the land, one of the local emperors in the area, or one of the local noblemen in the area, their house gets like ransacked. Like giant mobs of people come and they steal their riches and almost burn down the house. So at that time, Wang Long is able to steal some gems, and he gives a special set of pearls to Olan to keep. She keeps them between her breasts and stores them right next to her heart in her chest for years. But the rest of the jewels they actually exchange for land again at the Huang house when they go back to their land. So at that point, they're able to gain even more land. So even though they had lived in poverty for a long time and lived in the city, they moved back to the rural area, and there they're able to cultivate their land and cultivate more wealth. At this time, Olan had a set of twins, one boy and one girl, which is another sign of fortune and wealth. To have two babies, to have both of them survive, and for one of them to be a boy is major. So the younger girl, does take to her poor fool of a sister, but at the same time the mentally handicapped sister just kind of is off the radar, and they don't really focus on taking care of her. She kind of becomes a burden. And then the youngest daughter, who's the twin, she is responsible for working with Olan to keep the house happy and keep domestic things in check, while the boys work on the farm. Eventually, Wang Long decides to send the boys to school so they can become scholars, because at this point they can afford it after they bought off land from the Huang household. So they grow more land, or harvest more land, and eventually Ching works for them, their family friend who owned a farm. He works for them on their farm. They become a larger plantation-style farm, and Wang Long decides to get his own slaves. So at this point, he can afford riches, he has a large family, and he began to climb the social ladder. This also ostracized him from his extended family. So his father, who is still alive at this point, his uncle, and his cousins, they began to kind of mooch off the family. And they begin living with them because it's their family duty for the most rich people to take care of all of their extended family. So that becomes an issue. Eventually, they have enough money that Wang Long begins to spend it more frivolously. So they buy expensive clothes for the family, they get more slaves, he goes to the tea house regularly, and he climbs a social ladder in the community so that instead of being seen as a peasant, he is seen as a slave and landowner. Eventually, he will take in Lotus Flower as his mistress, because she used to be a part of the House of Huang, which is slowly falling. So the Huangs, the emperor and the empress, they're actually losing money. Their sons are sleeping around, and they're not sticking with their studies, and they're addicted to opium, which was still a big issue at the time. So that household is falling, and the Wang dynasty family, which is the center of this whole trilogy, they're becoming the major aristocratic force in the community. So with Lotus Flower, the mistress, comes Cuckoo, which is one of the assistants that used to be in the House of Huang, who Wang can now afford to take in. So Lotus Flower is high maintenance, very high maintenance, and she becomes the mistress, and she becomes the head of the household when it comes to the women, because she has Cuckoo under her. And eventually she asks for Pear Blossom, who is another slave who was born into the Huang household that moves in. So Wang now has enough riches that he can take all of these slaves in and have a mistress, whereas Olan, his wife, who was born into slavery, is forced to still take on the domestic roles in the household. So that creates a lot of stress between Olan and Wang, and eventually their family begins to deteriorate because their sons don't necessarily want to be scholars anymore, and they have to focus on marrying off their daughter, because when a Chinese woman marries, she becomes a part of another family. So Wang becomes stressed out. He has to focus on those things. And eventually his father and Olan end up dying in the same year, which is a major part of their story, because he had to build extra houses so that he could keep his women separate. And now Olan is gone, and there's no one to take on that domestic role, and his daughter's been married off. and his aunt and his uncles still mooch off of him, and he has begun giving them opium to buy them off so that they leave him alone. So at this point, the sons end up moving away, getting jobs, getting wives, and it's just Wang and his mistress who's become even more demanding, and they become kind of ostracized from each other. And then he has his aunts and uncles who are just smoking opium all day in their house, and his father is dead and his wife is dead, and really all he has left is his poor fool, who he loves unconditionally, and he watches after her because he knows that she's not going to be able to take care of herself. At this point, Pear Blossom's still around, the mistress's assistant, but the burden of having so much money and so much responsibility becomes too much for Wang Lung, because he can't take care of his land anymore, but he has to be in charge, and his sons kind of have left him in the dust. They think that they should just sell off the land and live off the rest of the wealth, because they didn't want to be farmers. He wanted at least one of his sons to not be a scholar and to be a farmer, and none of them want to work the land. None of them want to stay on the farm. They all want to move away and live in the city and have their own families and just be rich and have the best silks and, the best mistresses. And Wang Lung feels like he's lost his family's history, and he finds out at the end of the book before his passing that he should have just stayed a simple farmer. He's a simple man. He shouldn't have used all of his wealth to climb social ladders, because now his children don't understand all that he went through to gain such an aristocratic position, to gain wealth, to gain all of these social attributes. So in the end, he doesn't have anything. All he has is his poor fool and a rowdy mistress and aunts and uncles that take advantage of him. And he realizes that in the end, he's disconnected from his land, which was one of his most important connections to the earth in the beginning. So at the end of the book, you're left with this solemn feeling that most of the time, instead of pushing forward and climbing ladders and striving, we should just stay where we are, because that's where we're meant to be in the first part. Not saying that you shouldn't succeed and succeed more than your parents and your previous generations before you, but that you shouldn't deny who you truly are inside, and that him gaining wealth, becoming an aristocratic, noble family really didn't mean anything in the end. What did he really have to show for it besides broken relationships and an angry wife? So a couple major quotes. One is from the introduction. And this is when they first move to the city because they're poor and they can't take to their land and they can't cultivate their land because they don't have the resources for it. This is when Wang Lung is making a comment on the emperor who lived in the city that they moved to. So it said, and listening to all the things that they would do if they had these things, Wang Lung heard only of much they would eat and sleep, and what dainties they would eat, and that they had never tasted, and how they would gamble in this great tea shop and that what pretty women they would buy for their lust. And above all, how none would ever work again, even as the rich man behind the wall never worked. So just saying that there are so many amazing, luxurious things that these emperors have. They have tea shops, and they don't have to work, and they have mistresses that they can, call on whenever they need them, and all of those things. And he was just in awe of the riches that these families have, and he wanted to achieve it because that's what most people strive for. They strive for wealth, they strive for success. The next quote I have is from The Center of the Conflict. So this is towards the last half of the novel when Wang Lung is with his mistress, Lotus Flower, a lot, and Olan can't handle having another woman in the house. She is in charge of all the domestics around the house. She's in charge of cooking and cleaning and taking care of the elders and taking care of the children, and she feels overwhelmed. And Wang Lung makes it worse by coming in and forcing her to give up the pearls that she had kept in her chest for so long to give to Lotus Flower, which is the biggest stab in the back he could ever do. He was doing it to spite her. So it says, then slowly she thrust her wet, wrinkled hand into her bosom, and she drew forth the package. She gave it to him, and watched him as he unwrapped it. And then the pearls lay in his hand, and they caught softly and fully the light of the sun, and he laughed. But Olan returned to the beating of his clothes, and when the tears dropped slowly and heavily from her eyes, she did not put her hand up to wipe them away. only she beat more steadily with her wooden stick upon the clothes and spread it over the stone. So that quote is written in a way that makes you take on Olan's pain. You feel that weeping agony that she has in her chest, that she took this husband and thought everything was going to be fine, and they leave a quiet, unassuming peasant life, and now she is the wife of a nobleman who has decided to spend his time with a mistress, and she feels the weight of the world on her shoulders as she takes care of their growing household, which just gets bigger and bigger by year as her husband, or as her sons become husbands and their wives have more children, and she's in charge of grandchildren and elders, and she is not only overwhelmed with her responsibilities but also with Wang Wang's neglect of her as a wife. Instead of having a trusting relationship that she thought that they originally had, he has cast her aside and brought on another woman, a younger woman. And so at the end of the book, there's a quote from the climax of the book, which is where Wang Wang is confronting his sons who want to sell all of their property and just live off their wealth that they have accumulated over the years. And he says, "Now evil, idle sons, sell the land. It is the end of a family when they begin to sell the land. Out of the land we came, and into it we must go. And if you will hold your land, you can live. No one can rob you of land. If you sell the land, it is the end." So he returns back to his original ideals that he held on to as a peasant, that the land is one of the most important commodities you can have, because no one can steal it from you. They might steal your crops, but no one can sabotage your land, and that it's most important to be connected to the earth. And in the end, we all go back to the earth. So he wanted to stay on his ancestral farmland until he died. He wanted to stay there. He wanted to cultivate the land. He wanted to reap the benefits of the land and give back to it, make sure his soil is still fertile. And in the end, his ashes would become dust and he would be a part of the land. But he can't do that because he didn't teach his sons to value the land like he should have. And so they just step on all of his ideals. And in the end, he dies without reconciling that. So those quotes stood out to me as important because they displayed a lot of the themes in the book. Another important part that they play is that they connect to the themes, as in the theme about the rights of women, the theme of dynasties, and the ebb and flow of the nobles in the area. And so for the section tying this book to the humanities course that we're taking, I think this book actually, although it's kind of a stretch, it reminds me a lot of when we talk about the Tudors in class. Because Henry, although he was born into his own dynasty, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, the way that he valued the women in his life is a lot like the way that Wang Wang treated women. There were just a lot of similarities between talking about pre-Elizabethan England and the way that women were supposed to produce sons, the way that you could almost just get rid of a wife if she didn't produce a son that you wanted, or you just had irreconcilable differences. The way that women were almost treated like a commodity, and that marrying up or marrying down was very important. Dowries were very, very important. The same thing was happening in China in the 30s even. Women were binding their feet to be attractive, which is so violent. They break all of their toes when they're 5 or 6 years old and wrap tight bandages around their feet so that their feet don't get too big, because then they won't be attractive. And the idea that women shouldn't be working out in the fields because they'll get tan. And if you get tan, you mean less because it means that you're a peasant and you have to work. So just the idea that even though you have all of these resources and all of this wealth, and you're an aristocrat and you have the approval of society for being so noble, that doesn't mean that you live a noble life. And oftentimes people who are noble don't get to enjoy the simplicities of life. And Wang Wang realized that as his life went on, he slowly lost track of the things that he valued most when he first started off and wanted to strive and wanted to succeed for the value of family. So I just thought it was interesting to talk about women's role in China, but also how women have been taught to act historically. So even though this book took place in China in the 30s, it was actually a lot more like the Tudors at the time. So although half a world away, East meets West, I still think that that's something that stood out to me as a connection to what we've been talking about, because our class hasn't focused very much on Eastern history, it's focused on the Western humanities. But across the board, women were just mistreated and still are to this day, which is something that Buck really, really valued as one of her humanitarian efforts, to go out to not only become an activist where she lived, but also spread the word of her beliefs through historical fiction. And just like in England, the Tudors were almost a dynasty within themselves, and they were in control, and then that ebbs and flows, just like Chinese dynasties and the rule of noblemen in the rural areas and provinces in China. Moving on to my personal critique, obviously this book is highly acclaimed because of the Pulitzer Prize that it received, Pearl S. Buck's Nobel Peace Prize that she received in 1938 for literature, but also the fact that this book became a trilogy says a lot about how successful it was. So Buck was able to not only succeed in giving her message to the world through her book, but also because she was able to write an entire trilogy about this Wang dynasty, as she called it, the House of Wang. So I have a personal connection to this book because I am studying Chinese, and in a year I'm going to start my master's in Chinese medicine, so traditional Oriental medicine and herbology. So I have a big interest in Eastern culture. It's been a great book to read because it gave me some more historical context, and I was able to apply that later on in the semester. And I watched a lot of documentaries about Chinese culture, and it was just interesting to get more of a personal perspective of the things that Buck had seen when she was working in China in the 30s, and also traditions that are still important. Although this book was very raw, a lot of raw descriptions on birth and breastfeeding and poverty and disease and malnutrition and violence and, Wang Wang's taking of mistresses and lust, which was a lot different than books that I've read in the past, because I typically don't read books that are that raw. I think that brought a lot to it because it's a natural book. It's about our connection to the earth, and so just the descriptions of kind of not gory, nasty, but stuff like birth and breastfeeding and connection between man and woman and the connection between child and mother was just something that I was glad that I was able to be exposed to as I move on and read more adult books in my college classes. I think I got a lot out of the book because it was something that pertained to my interest, but I think anyone who even isn't that interested in Chinese culture could get something out of it, especially because most people are aware of the one-child policy in China and are aware of female infanticide in the area, in a lot of areas out east, but mostly in China. So I think that was something that a lot of people could benefit from if they read the book. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed Buck's writing style, and I appreciate the work that she put into publicizing this book, because it was important to her that other people understand China at that time, especially when we were about to pair up with China to fight against Japan. So something that I would highly recommend to even those who aren't that interested in Chinese culture. And I think that is the conclusion of my presentation.